So welcome everybody to the Havel Hugo P. Cecchini annual event, Taking Action Now, How Does Applied Research Address the Food and Climate Emergency? I'll just go through a few housekeeping rules and then we will hand over to our speakers. So my name, everyone, is Marina. I'm the communications manager for the Cecchini Institute. So our rules of engagement for today, for those of you joining us in person, just to make sure that you adhere to the distancing of 1.5 meters. So for those of you that are sitting at the desks here, just please don't scooch, don't move the chairs closer, keep them at the ends of the desk. They have been measured to stay at this distance. Masks must be worn at all times unless you're eating, drinking, or unless you are the presenter. The presenters are allowed to take their masks off as they're speaking. We will have a short coffee break. So when you are getting a snack, just make sure you come into this room and then you take a seat. You're not allowed to have your coffee or snacks outside standing and speaking with the other participants. For those of you that are joining us online, just make sure your microphones are muted. They're muted by default, but please make sure you don't unmute unless you're the presenter. And then you can post your questions in the chat throughout the sessions. So during the plenary as well as the breakout sessions, and they will be answered by our presenters the best we can at the end of their presentation. Just a quick look at our program here today. So we'll start off in a minute with opening remarks in our keynote presentation, followed by a short Q&A, and then you will need to choose one of the breakout sessions, and we'll have more information for you on that after the keynote. Then there will be a coffee break, and for those of you that are joining online or would like to come back to the room and follow the poster session, that will be streamed as a video. Then we will have highlights from our moderators from the 3 breakout sessions, followed by the closing remarks and the apéro. So without further ado, I hand the mic over to Dr. Ute Zelling, Director of BFH Havel.
Yes, thank you, Marina. Dear participants of this annual event of our Hugo P. Cecchini Institute at Havel. We are very happy and we are really proud that we can arrange this hybrid event as one of the first bigger conferences in this year. And I really apologize that I cannot participate personally today. Nevertheless, I want to give you a very warm welcome directly at Havel or for the others on the screen. This event has a very actual topic, taking action now. How does applied research address the food and climate emergency? And it is the contribution of BFH Havel and of their partners to the UN Food Systems Summit 2021. This Food Systems Summit is planned by the UN for September or October this year. The aim is to maximize the co-benefits of a food systems approach across the 2030 agenda and meeting the challenges of climate change. The summit will be a platform for ambitious new actions, innovative solutions, and plans to transform food systems and to deliver progress across all of the SDGs. So I think it couldn't be a better time for pre-discussions of the most relevant topics of the summit, concentrating today on applied research. These will be tackled this afternoon in the keynotes and later on in the different sessions. But let me say some words to our institute at Havel. The Hugo P. Cecchini Institute was established in February 2020, so just shortly before COVID-19 reached Europe and Switzerland. The focus of this institute is the international cooperation and development. The institute is young, but the topic has a long tradition and all activities are based on more than 30 years experience and involvement in developing and emerging countries. The aim of the Institute is on the one hand to increase the visibility and further develop Havel's activities in non-OECD countries, and on the other hand to unite all the activities of Havel so from agriculture, from forestry, from food sciences and knowledge management, under a single umbrella and to develop strong global partnerships. Despite COVID-19, many projects were continued or even newly were acquired. There are currently almost 50 ongoing projects. Involved in these projects were persons from HAFL staff, as well as many students. For the coordination of these activities, the Institute has a small but powerful team under the director, Dominique Guénard. The Institute is of high strategic importance, not only for HAFL, but for BFH in total. Because our new director at BFH, Sebastian Wörwag, has planned to raise more attention to the international activities. So I come to the end and wish you and for us all interesting keynotes and fruitful discussions this afternoon. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much, Ute. With that, we pass the word over to Dr. Lynette Neufeld and to give us her keynote presentation. Please welcome on stage.
Hello, everyone. First of all, just a big thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to talk on the topic of implementation research and how it can support us in the strive towards sustainable, healthy diets. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about diets and their centrality to all forms of malnutrition, and then why an implementation research or an applied research focus. I think we can use those terms perhaps synonymously for the talk that I'm going to give today. I'm going to give you some examples. I'm a nutritionist with working 35 years in the field of nutrition, so I won't endeavor to speak to the area that you all know better, which is more on the sustainable food production side. But I'm going to give you some examples from the world of nutrition, but then come back and what that means for sustainability and for sustainable healthy diets, which is the goal as noted related to the Food Systems Summit. And then again, what do we need to do next to be achieving this goal? So first of all, in terms of nutrition, the world is currently not on track to reach the goals that have been set to improve the nutritional status of the population. The World Health Assembly has established targets related to child linear growth faltering, which is one of the critically important manifestations of early childhood malnutrition, for wasting, for anemia and micronutrient malnutrition in women and in children, as well as obesity. And as you can see, the countries that are, or the numbers that are illustrated here in orange are the number of countries that are showing no progress towards achieving those targets. And there is far too much orange on this chart, particularly if you look on the right-hand side that focuses on the indicators related to overweight and obesity and related non-communicable diseases. This is pre-COVID. This progress was the latest global nutrition report that was published just before the world changed into the form that we currently know it. If we look at what is likely to be happening now with the many situations that are changing both economic and social impacts because of the COVID pandemic, the situation is worsening substantially. This is a publication that will be coming out very shortly in Nature Food. A group of experts came together last year to model the impacts of what the pandemic is likely to do for the progress towards critical indicators of child malnutrition and malnutrition in women. And what you can see is that they modeled, sorry, just before I go, they modeled an optimistic, a moderate, and a pessimistic scenario. When they first were looking at publishing this, they looked at the different criteria that they had used for that moderate scenario and said, we think that's what's going to happen. But the reality is now that that group is reassessing the criteria that they put into that moderate and that pessimistic scenario. And we believe that the world, sadly, has moved towards that pessimistic scenario. So what we expect under that pessimistic scenario is, given COVID, 2.5 million additional cases of wasting in children and 3.5 million additional cases of linear growth faltering or stunting in children. If we consider the well-documented economic impact of stunting and wasting, you can see that in terms of national productivity, the implications of this situation is dire. So why do we relate that to the talk today, which is about sustainable, healthy diets? And I mention that because even before COVID, most countries around the world are experiencing what we now call the double burden of malnutrition, which is the common existence of both forms of undernourishment, as well as forms of overweight and obesity and related chronic diseases. There are few low and middle income countries that are not simultaneously addressing this challenge. And while the etiology of that at an individual, that same person who is the child who is stunted is also obese, or the woman who is anemic is also overweight and has a diet-related chronic disease, or at a household or at a national level, the etiology of that combined dual burden of malnutrition is very complex, as you can see in this publication of this framework of the causes that was published last year in the Lancet Double Burden of Nutrition series. Dietary intake is at the core of all of those forms of malnutrition. It's, as the epidemiological terminology we use, it's a necessary, although insufficient condition. All forms of malnutrition have inadequate dietary intake at their core. So we have to fix the problems of our food system that continue to perpetuate the problems of malnutrition, again, both on the side of insufficient dietary intake of high quality nutritious foods, but also the overconsumption of energy and the wrong balance and types of foods that leads to overweight and obesity. Added to that complexity, diets influence and are influenced by the environment. We know that climate change is affecting the nutrient value of some crops, which could potentially influence the quality of the diet of individuals who rely heavily on those foods. And we know that our diets and what we consume influences food production and has an influence on many of the different influences on the environment and on climate. So again, we're finding diets at the heart of this complex problem. So how can implementation research help all of that? First, I want to take a moment to talk about what the terminology that I use around implementation research. And fairly common in the field of nutrition, at least. I think it's quite a parallel concept to the applied nutrition, but let's take a moment to talk about that. The distinguishing feature of what we call implementation research is not the research methodology used. It's the question and the purpose of what you're trying to answer. It's trying to inform a decision that needs to be taken related to a problem for human, planetary, or other health, for example, in this case. So it's not the defining feature, the methodology. We may use randomized controlled trials. We may use quantitative cohort studies. We may use any kind of different methodology. The distinguishing feature is what we're going to do with that information. Why is that so important? It's important because centrality of the methodology and the approach that we're going to use is the relevance, again, for that question that we need to answer. What do we already know about the situation? What is it that we need to decide in this programmatic context that is missing some evidence that we're trying to generate? One of the things that we may do different in implementation research than if we were just doing what we might call discovery research is that our choice of the best methodology may need to be adapted to, say, the best fit for purpose methodology. If a decision needs to be taken, there may be a time frame for that decision. There may be a resource implications in related to how far the quantity of resources that can be used towards that decision. There may be programmatic constraints. For example, we may not be able to randomize individuals because maybe this intervention is implemented at a public health level and there's no possibility to use a randomized control trial. So best fit for purpose methodology. But the best fit for purpose methodology does not mean compromising in rigor. Science, the rigor in science is not defined by the methodological approach that's taken. It's defined by clarity of research questions, that fit for purpose methodology, and still applying the rigor, the same quality assurance within that scientific approach that we apply to all science. So we still need to ensure rigor, regardless of our design or our methodological approach. And finally, one of the most difficult challenges is timeliness. I come from an academic background. I'm now working at an international organization, but I started my career at the National Institute of Public Health in Mexico, which is a Mexican government research and teaching institute. And we were analyzing and evaluating programs in that context. We wanted to take months to analyze and reanalyze and clean our data and look hard. And the program said, I need these results tomorrow, because the government is making a decision tomorrow about the continued financing for this program. And if I don't have the evidence, how am I going to negotiate more funding? So that's a bit of an exaggerated example, but you understand where I'm going. The challenge of balancing, ensuring that rigor and ensuring that you can realize that rigor, but not compromise it, but yet make programmatic decision timelines is a really important component of quality and implementation research. Okay, so let's talk about some examples from sustainable healthy diets. And again, my talk is going to be mostly about on the diet side of that. So despite the fact that diets are so central to all forms of malnutrition, diets are actually incredibly poorly characterized in the world. You would be really surprised. It's quite baffling why we have so little information on diets. So I'm going to pose 4 questions through the course of this presentation and then give you some examples of how we've used implementation, we or others have used implementation research to get at and try to get into that question. So I won't read off the questions now, we'll go through them one by one. So the first, how do we know enough, do we know enough about what adolescents eat and why to formulate recommendations so that we can develop programs to improve the dietary intake of adolescents? Why is it so important? Adolescents are different than children. They have much more autonomy. They have agency. They make choices. They don't just eat what their mother put on their plate and spoon feeds in. I'm going to speak to that. I have 2. It's a constant struggle, ensuring that your adolescents eat healthy. But the reality is there is no systematic data globally that tells us what the quantitative nutrient intake, so to understand really the nutrients that they're taking. There's been very few studies that have been done at population level. We know little about national, global, regional trends and the characterization of that within subgroups of the population. There's been studies, small studies, that look at food choice among adolescents, but they tend to be quite small and very local. And the intervention potential of different strategies has been minimally studied in terms of actually looking at the effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and so forth. So several years ago, myself and George Patton, who's an expert in the field of adolescent health, commissioned a Lancet series on adolescent nutrition. And I'm not going to go into the details of that. It will be published this fall. But what we did was review and consolidate evidence that does exist, use novel data pooling techniques for qualitative research to be able to amplify those results that were very small and very micro and say, what can we learn from this? How can we set priorities? Can we make some recommendations even though the evidence doesn't exist as much as and robustly as we would like it to? And this is important because in the field of adolescent nutrition, we were in a bit of a catch-22. Donors would say, well, we don't really know what the problem is. We don't really know the solutions for improving diets in adolescents, so we won't fund you. And we can't generate that evidence because there's so few programs that are ongoing. So that's a little sneak peek into some of the recommendations that will come out, specifically in this regard related to school food programs, which are the one area where there's a lot of programs. The second question that I want to talk about is, can we embed a simple tool to characterize diets in existing large-scale surveys? There's so many large-scale surveys around that measure health, that measure economic considerations, even nutritional status, height and weight, and so forth. But most of them don't include dietary intake because it's very complex to characterize dietary intake. So with a very generous contribution by SDC, the Swiss Development Corporation, as well as several other donors and partners at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Gallup World Poll, we've been working to develop a module for the Gallup World Poll that can characterize diets of all of those who respond to the Gallup World Poll. Why is that so important? The Gallup World Poll is in 190 countries annually. So if we can get a module that is viable, feasible, and valid, again, not compromising on the rigor of the data that we want to generate, we can generate and start to fill that gap of existing information about dietary patterns globally. Just a bit of a glimpse of what's going on in this regard. We now have funding to embed that tool into 42 countries, and that will happen in 2021 for the first time. The module has been adapted to those 42 countries. And just to show you what happened, Tanzania was one of the test countries. To give you a bit of a sense, this particular graph helps us illustrate how there are substantial gender differences in dietary patterns in the diets of adults in Tanzania. And that's one of the things that the country can be using and to pick up as an example of what might be needed to explore improving healthy diets. So these are very rapid fire review of all of these. Obviously, there's a lot more that sits underneath them. The third example I want to talk about is food fortification. I'm sure you all know that there are many different programs globally that fortify food. Salt iodization was one of the first modules, and Switzerland was one of the first countries in the world to do that, responding to 100 years ago to the high prevalence of goiter, which is a defect or that develops of the thyroid gland in response to severe iodine deficiency. We know that this is a highly effective, from research, from rigorous randomized controlled trials, that this is a highly effective approach to reduce micronutrient deficiency and some of the manifestations like anemia and related health issues as a result. But what happens in programs? What do we know about programs? When we move away from that controlled setting where industry is complying because they're being paid to do that in a controlled research setting, what happens with programs? We also had no, amazingly enough, even though it's existed for 100 years, we had no standardized mechanism, metrics, and methodology to measure the coverage of those programs and the nutrient contribution towards the diets and the extent to which those diets were adequately being covered in nutrients. So again, with funding from several different donors and using clear pathways to impact of what a successful fortification program looks like, we developed a tool to try to address these issues. So the tool, this just highlights the fact that one of the big challenges is that reliable evidence of the quality of the product itself and reliable evidence of the coverage of the program in the population, and particularly, for example, among those who are most vulnerable to micronutrient deficiency, like rural, low-income populations in, for example, low-income countries. So we used a health coverage cascade model that was developed by Tanahashi in the 1970s that looks at, this was designed for healthcare coverage, going from exposure to an intervention all the way through effective coverage where that the exposure to that intervention was sufficient to resolve the health problem. And we used a similar cascade to look at where is the food, where is fortified food available, who's consuming it, what's the quality of it, how much do people consume, and how much does that contribute to their daily requirements of that nutrient, and then how does that distribute across the population among different subgroups of that population. And then use that to look at, do programs need to be canceled? Do they need to be modified? Do they need to be improved? And do they need complementary strategies to try to fill those nutrient gaps? The results identified many different inefficiencies in programs. These are data from Nigeria. And what you can see, let's look just at the left-hand side at oil. The blue bar tells us who consumes oil in the country. And what you can see is almost every single household. These are nationally representative data. Sorry, these are state level representative data. So these are from, I think, Kano State in Nigeria. So almost every household uses oil to cook. Yet only, it's very small, 36% of those households use oil that falls under the mandatory fortification legislation that exists. The other 70% or 65% of the households process their own oil or use oil that was processed by very small manufacturers that are not covered under the mandatory fortification program of Nigeria. So we have a problem there. That could be fully fortified, that oil, but it will only ever reach a maximum of 36% of that population. If we look at the case of semolina flour, only about 13% of the population uses semolina flour. So why are we fortifying semolina flour? We're only ever going to reach 13% of the population, even if that's a perfectly implemented program. And finally, let's take a look at the other side of the graph, which is shows the results for example, wheat flour. What we see in the case of wheat flour is about 85% of the population are using it, the blue bar. The orange bar, about exactly the same percent are using the form of that flour that falls under the mandatory legislation. So we could reach everybody who consumes flour with a properly implemented fortification program, and 85% of the population. But only 22% of that flour is fortified. Industry is not complying, even though it's by law mandatory that they fortify their flour. So this information tells us exactly what the problems are and permits us to look at a next step. This is about coverage. The next step is, what's the potential for impact? So here I'm going to show you two graphs. One from salt iodization in South Africa. And what you see there is that a solid line is the contribution of iodine from salt, from the salt iodization program. And what you can see with the dotted line is the estimated average requirement of, which means that 50% of the population, their requirement sits above and below that line, right? So you have a perfectly normal distribution in this example, and that EAR, do I have a pointer here? Right, that EAR tells you that a large proportion of the population are meeting their requirements with the current level of fortification, and that if you fortify perfectly to the standard, you will get a little bit more, a few more people meeting their needs, but not very many. Why is that? Because the program is operating as it should be. It is already fortified essentially to standard. And the other thing we want to make sure is nobody's at risk of eating too much and receiving too much nutrient. So the UL is what's called the upper tolerable limit. And that means we don't want anybody consuming that nutrient above the upper tolerable limit, because that tells you that's the limit at which nutrients may have some type of side effect or adverse consumption. Remember that nutrients are essential, but they also have a U-shaped curve of their essentiality. It damage if they're too low and damage if they're too high. So if we look at the case of vitamin A, here we have the current situation where you can see, again, this is because, remember, we go back to that example of industry not complying in terms of the fortifying as the legislation says, right? So you can see that the contribution to estimated average requirement under the current scenario is very low. Many people are not being met, needs are not being met for vitamin A, given the current level of fortification. On the other hand, the government has mandated vitamin A, this is vitamin A example, they've mandated fortification of oil, sugar, wheat, maize, and semolina flour, all of those in the state of Lagos of Nigeria. If all of those food vehicles are fortified to their mandated standard, what you're going to see is many people in the population consuming above their requirements. So that's a problem. So the recommendations that we sent back to the government of Nigeria are, number one, reduce the number of food vehicles, pick them well, pick the ones that have a potential for high coverage. Don't overestimate the need. Here we have too many different food vehicles being fortified under mandatory legislation. Reduce the number of vehicles and then work with industry and monitor and enforce your fortification program so that you get a picture that looks a bit more like this, where the contribution is significant, those deficiencies will reduce, and you don't put anybody in the population at risk of overconsumption. So that's a bit of an example from nutrients. And now I want to come back to my final example, which brings us back a little bit to this concept of sustainable healthy diet. There are definitely going to be trade-offs when we think about sustainable healthy diet. Some of the things that we need for nutrition aren't necessarily going to be good for the environment. Some of the things that are going to be good for the environment may not be good for nutrition. How are we going to manage that? The first modeled exercise of trying to bring that, or first best well-known, shall we say, modeled exercise of bringing those constructs together, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the Eat Lancet Commission diet that was published a couple of years ago now. They put forth what you might call a prescriptive diet. They didn't say what's the dietary pattern. They said, if the world reduces and changes their consumption to these ranges, we can optimize both health outcomes as well as environmental outcomes, right? So most of you are probably familiar with that. And that's just an example of the diet that they proposed here. This was a seminal piece of work in getting people to start thinking about what we eat has implications for not just our own health, but for the planetary health. And it really started to change that narrative in a much more large segment of the population and outside of that expert community. It was heavily critiqued because of that on all kinds of grounds: evolution, economics, epidemiology, ethics, environment, all kinds of criticisms. You can see some of the quotes that I copied there just for interest. But it was also heavily praised and won awards. For example, the award from Sweden. Somebody else might be able to translate the name of that award. I'm afraid I don't know. but it was really a seminal piece of work. But what does that mean? How do we actually implement that diet? What do we need to do to go from a diet that people looked at and said, that doesn't look like what I eat? I have been coming from a tradition of eating for generations. Doesn't look like what I eat. So how do we move from that prescription of a set of recommendations that can optimize human health and planetary health into something that people, you and I, might be exceptions. You know, I'm a nutrition expert, I can rationalize it, but my husband, for example, looked at that diet and said, no way, I'm not eating that. That's not what I eat. Comes from a very strong tradition that didn't reflect the diet in that table. This is where we need, again, we need implementation research. And I'm going to show, this is not work that has been done by my group or my team. These are some studies that have been done elsewhere. And I realized those are very difficult graphs to show, but I wanted to show them because I think they're the kinds of things that we need to do. Again, this was done on the nutrition side. What do current dietary patterns look like? This is from Mexico. What do current dietary patterns look like? How do those current dietary patterns reflect compared to national guidelines? And so the blue, some of the blue on the blue bars show how they compare to the Mexican recommendations, or they show what the blue bar, sorry, the blue bar shows you what the Mexican recommendations are. The other color bars show you what current different population subgroups are actually consuming. And then the line that goes across shows you the level that is recommended by the Eat Lancet Commission diet. And what you can see is that there's pretty much alignment in none of the categories. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that? How do we take that to the next stage to say, how can we change health for human health? How can we change these dietary patterns? And how can we do that in a set of criteria that can also optimize planetary health? So this is very interesting. These were published just a few weeks ago by the institute that I used to work at in Mexico. And what they did was that they are now taking those results to both the health side, the health secretariat, but also to agriculture and the food industry, and saying, let's work together. This is where we sit now. Let's reestablish that. What should we reestablish? Should we aim for the Eat Lancet diet? Or should we adapt that a little bit so that it looks a little bit more like a Mexican pattern that people can feel comfortable with and relate to and ultimately commit to consume? But then on the industry side, on the agriculture side, what needs to be done to change the production patterns and the means of production so that they can be optimized for environmental health as well. So that's on the Mexican side. And then I'm just going to show you one final graph from India. This graph illustrates the current cost of the estimated cost of the Indian diet here in a minimum and an average. And here's the estimated cost in India at a minimum and an average of the Eat Lancet diet. That's telling the population, if we think, and I think that, you know, the big difference, as you probably all know, there's a lot of vegetarian diets in India, whereas if you look at this back here to Mexico, you can see that the Mexican diet is very heavily animal-based protein, red meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and so forth. It's a very animal source-based diet, right? So there's a major difference here in affordability of this diet. And that's mostly because on the national level in India, it will imply increasing animal source foods. If you were to take that Eat Lancet diet literally and say, let's adapt this literally. Now, would you want to do that in a country where there's a high proportion of vegetarians? Probably not. Again, it's a question of adapting it and looking at what are the constraints on the dietary side, what are the production methodologies that can be done on the production side to find those trade-offs and come up with a localized appropriate version.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming back from our exciting breakout sessions. I think we all had a lot to discuss during these. And now to recap some of these discussions, I would like to call on our moderators to give us some of the impressions and some of the summaries from the sessions for those of us that were not able to attend all three, unfortunately. So first up, we have Filippo Lehtala. Filippo, would you come please?
Thank you, Marina. So I have 5 minutes, right?
5 minutes.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to this event. So I will try to summarize in 5 minutes the most important insights from the session, but also try to highlight or extract 1 or 2 take-home messages from my side. So just to remind us, the guiding question of this event is how applied research, or research aimed at answering operational questions, how applied research addresses the climate and food emergency. The first session was about nutrition, sustainable consumption patterns, and food economics. So it majorly addressed the second issue, the food emergency. I also remind us that this first session was aligned with the first 2 action tracks of the UN Food System Summit. So it's about access to safe and nutritious food, and it's about the shift required in consumption patterns. So in the first part, now for those who were not present at this first session, I will quickly go through the most important points of the presentation. In the second part, I will try to grasp kind of the overarching messages coming out from this contribution. So we had a first contribution from Jacqueline Rivelli that looked at the interlinkages between cultural factors and dietary diversity in rural Madagascar. It was a mixed method study, a contextual study, a case study for a specific area. It looked at the food security concept mainly through the access and utilization lens. So how does consumption pattern rely, or how they compare the kind of dietary recommendation, what is the impact on actual dietary practices, mainly for children. So the research shows that cultural factors matter, because there are different components that were important, social events, rituals, rumors, and that they have a potential impact on nutritional outcomes. I think that's what I've retained and what we must be careful when designing policy measures looking into rural context, valid maybe for sub-Saharan Africa. We have a second, so it will not follow the order of presentation. We have a second contribution. We stay in Africa from Lucille Galifa, looking again at interlinkages, but this time between small-scale production systems, agricultural production systems, and food security at household level. This research is a qualitative research which was conceptualized around the sustainable livelihood approach. So it really embraces the multi-sectoral property of food systems, so looking at both agricultural production and specific components of food security. So what I've retained there is that to grasp the complexity of these linkages between agricultural production, the household dynamics, and corresponding potential nutritional outcomes, we must choose operational frameworks that work. So the sustainable livelihood approach has proven to be able to simplify these relations and extract important recommendations. The second message I retain from this research is the important overarching role of women throughout different pathway levels and throughout different components of food security and rural household dynamics in this setting. The third contribution, we remain again in Africa, and we change a bit the context, is from Panyabar Yeki, concerned with nutritional outcomes, but this time in an urban context. So other profiles, other population profiling, nutritional profiles, and nutritional issues. And this research is true implementation research, being part of a bigger implementation project in urban areas, secondary cities around the world. So we've presented first insights from, let's say, a baseline study looking at nutritional outcomes, socioeconomic factors. What I've retained is, first of all, that COVID is really having a drag on what we are doing internationally, so that complex research and monitoring systems are difficult to maintain, to observe, to maintain the quality required and be sure that the results can be used. And secondly, I think important, have a look at my notes. The importance of good situational analysis, especially where data situation is limited, and it's also in a multidisciplinary project to be able to combine different types of information in food systems research and make it work or make it actionable then for food system strengthening. So we'll now close this summary with the more overarching issue. One overarching issue is very obvious. So all of this research or all of these projects are based mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, which of course is notoriously in strong need of food system strengthening. So this contribution reminds us on the importance to pay attention to the most vulnerable settings when implementing policies to strengthen the food system, which is also in line with these distinctive features of the SDGs that really reach the poorest and most vulnerable populations. The second overarching issues, and I keep repeating that, is that the well-functioning food system or food security is not only about food being available, so food being produced or being imported. It's also about access to this food for all population groups. It's also about making good use of available and accessible food that leads then to the desired nutritional outcomes. So all of these contributions have pointed to this systemic complexity of these systemic processes and have shown potential way how to get a grip on this complexity through applied research and get a better understanding of the corresponding processes and leverages entry doors for policy measures. So applied research, implementation research does matter for effective policy design. It's clear, it's also been pointed out in the keynote speech. We must pay particular attention that we take into account the interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral property of food system in order to really be able to design effective policies. And also, this has also been pointed out at the beginning of the keynote speech, that stakeholder involvement is leading to demand-driven research, which is really relevant for beneficiaries in vulnerable areas. Thank you very much.
And now we have not Jürgen Blaser, but Tabea Allen. She will be speaking to us about boosting sustainable nature-positive production. Jürgen apologizes as he had an exam with his students, but Tabea was supporting him throughout the process and will deliver the remarks on his behalf. Thank you.
Yes, I'm for sure not Jürgen Blaser, but I will try to summarize the highlights of session 2, which, as Marina said, was on boosting sustainable nature-positive production. Likewise, to the other parallel sessions, we had the privilege to listen to and briefly exchange with 3 speakers who presented the practical experience of their practical experience and applied research findings. The first speaker focused more on a local national context. The second speaker focused more on the broader tropical biome with the specific example of India. And the third speaker addressed the global dimension of building appropriate capacities for sustainable nature-positive production to food and climate emergency. Firstly, Dr. Melanie Feurer, scientific collaborator at HFL, focused in her presentation on the effect of different land use and tenure systems on local communities in southern Myanmar. She combined participatory field research with spatial data to develop models for ecosystem services. There are many forest-related ecosystem services, but also some mismatches between supply and demand. Supply of subsistence food generally does not meet the demand of the local population in southern Myanmar. Climate regulation is strong in the forested highlands, but problematic near the coast. Environmental education, which also includes agricultural extension, is high in demand, but only provided to some extent in specific areas, such as nature reserves. Oil palm concessions strongly limit the ecosystem service outcome for local people. On the contrary, community forests and agroforestry provide a large portfolio of ecosystem services that they can directly access and influence. Compared to other land uses, they bring fewer trade-offs. Melanie concluded that integrating local land users' perspectives are integral to achieving the combined goals of food security and climate resilience. The second presentation was given by Dr. Hurvir Bular, senior scientist at HFL and previously senior staff at the Research Institute for Organic Agriculture, known as FIBL. He focused on the question, does organic farming offer a suitable choice for smallholders in the tropics? Hurvir used a particular example of a long-term 12-year-long farming system comparison trial in 3 different tropical countries, namely Bolivia, Kenya, and India. We only had time to look at a specific example of India, where a cotton-based farming system was looked at. The trial compared organic, biodynamic, GMO, and non-GMO systems. Some of the results are very interesting. In terms of productivity, legumes performed equally well in all systems. Cotton had on average a 20% lower yield in the organic systems. However, these systems were observed on station, but not on the farm level. Soil organic carbon and biodiversity were considerably higher in the organic system, showing the environmental benefits and also the ecosystem services of organic farming. In terms of profitability, the organic system had a higher return on inputs and equal benefit cost ratio. The trial also showed that organic farming is less capital intensive. So the major conclusion was that the organic farming can potentially be a suitable solution, especially for capital poor smallholders in the tropics. Then to the last presentation, this was given by Hans Jörg. He's recently retired corporate head of agriculture at Nestle and a member of board of some major international organizations dealing with agriculture globally. He shared with us really from his vast experience, and it's impossible to summarize this in just a minute. It was a very lively presentation, and he highlighted firstly the problematic of an overaging farming population. He focused then on an approach called agripreneurship that includes in Italia a potential change from conventional agriculture to regenerative agriculture, regenerative production system. And thereby this also includes increased resource efficiency and resilience to risk in climate variability and shocks. So a global challenge that we will face in the immediate future. He presented Nestle's agripreneurship approach where so-called lighthouse farmers are trained by Nestle. The basic principle is that they envision their future farm and then define the knowledge gaps that they need to achieve this future farm. And then they can receive training for this knowledge gap. The training includes regenerative agriculture, biodiversity stewardship, farm productivity, and also farm profitability. These lighthouse farmers then transfer the knowledge on to follower farmers through social media and also regular text messaging. They thereby make the lifestyle also more attractive to young youth farmers, which are currently lacking as farm owners. Hans also underlined the importance of empowerment of women in agripreneurship and the need to address knowledge sharing between farmers and youth. As a conclusion, essential for future farmers is getting a living income from farming and an attractive lifestyle to ensure the nexus between agriculture, nutrition, and health.
Thank you very much, Tabea. And last but not least, Johannes Brunner to speak to us about capacity development, resilience, and equitable livelihoods.
Thank you very much, Marina. I try to summarize the last session, parallel session 3, about capacity development, resilience, and equitable livelihood. I would like to give also an answer to the question that mentioned Filippo at the beginning: how does applied research address the food and climate emergency? And I was rather excited in this parallel session that I would say an answer could be co-production of knowledge or joint knowledge production, because we got insights in different cases about this approach, and every approach worked with that in a way. First, I would like to mention the food science, the food system dialogues, which was presented from Uli Naudeli and Felix Hintermann. This is an approach from Swiss Development Agency, and I think an interesting thing in this approach is that different stakeholders in the whole food value chain discuss visions about the food systems of the future, what should be changed, what should be ameliorated in this value chain. I can't mention everything, but I would point out one point, for instance, that the role of farmers should be valorized, that the farmers get importance, that they should be heard. And I make a little bit the same experience also when I work with farmers. And another thing that has also a relationship is the keynote speak from Dr. Neufeld, I think. Neufeld, excuse me. And Dr. Neufeld is the keynote speech from you, that we should integrate nutrition in school curricula and infant care, maternal infant care. That is also an important point. So these food system dialogues are held worldwide, and after that input we made some looks to two different cases from different countries. One approach, or the one case introduced by Professor Deepak. He is professor in Nepal, and Christine Hjort from Huffle. She presented the Knowledge for Climate Network. And the interesting thing of this approach, I think, is that they try in case of to develop in a collaborate learning approach different case studies to tackle the problems of climate change. They try to involve different perspectives of the people who are concerned with causes of climate change, and to develop, for instance, videos, to ask questions, and to involve different perspectives of people, how to tackle these problems about climate change issues and environmental changes. And like this, with this collaboration between different people, also of course of the local people that are really concerned with these changes, they try to develop teaching material and like this sensitize the people in a country. So also this collaborative to gain new knowledge, interesting. And last but not least, Elisabeth Eugster and myself, we presented a mandate that we had in Myanmar to implement competence-oriented teaching and learning in Yesin agriculture university in Myanmar, where we had to build up a new curriculum for food science and technology. And there we tried also in a collaborative curriculum, participatory curriculum development process to develop a curricula jointly with the private sector. It was interesting also to hear from the food science, food system dialogue that this was quite difficult to involve private sector stakeholders, the private sector actors, or even farmers who said they are too busy. And I think this is probably also a big challenge, that we can involve these people, because, but on the other hand, it is very important to involve these people. And I think if we can really to go for this co-production of knowledge approach, and if we listen to these people, then we can involve them and we can valorize them. And I think this would be very successful also to go further in our look to develop or to find solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. So without further ado, over to take us through the closing remarks, the head of the Havel-Hugo Piccicchini Institute, Dr. Dominique Guénat.
Thank you very much. So I will try not to repeat what the summaries have already highlighted. I noted a few points in my presentation, and starting, of course, from the question of today. We have talked about applied research. There were several different names under that concept, like implementation research. We talked of accompanying research, accompanying development endeavors, activities, and having research looking at solutions that that answer open questions that are coming up while implementing projects. So this is what we mean by applied research. There is a need not to oppose this kind of research to fundamental research, but there is space for the two types. We have just to make sure that the questions under applied research or implementation research are not just something of scientists. It's something that is involving stakeholders from different horizons, from different with different interests, and also the research questions should not be just what scientists want to analyze, but it should come from the stakeholders, the user's point of view. So the question, we have seen some highlights from examples from applied research in different fields, in different contexts. The next question is not only to be how does it address the food and climate emergency, but it's also does it work? And does it work? This question has also been partly addressed today by all the need of measuring, monitoring, finding out how much does this change in terms of outcomes, impacts, short-term, medium-term, long-term. So this is a whole field in which we are also strongly involved. We do have many activities where it's about measuring results, which is a need. Now, as soon as you do projects, as you implement activities, then you want to know whether it's useful or not. And especially in this field with the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation, we are quite often involved in measuring cost effectiveness or cost benefit of different projects. Now, the connection to the UN Food Systems Summit has been done already, so I will not read this definition. What is it all about? I would just say that today's event was our modest contribution to that event, and also that we are also participating with other development stakeholders, like in these food systems dialogue that were initiated by SDC. So this is setting the connection to that global event that is taking place. So today, our journey has started with Lynette Neufeld, who has brought us across it was like a global view across the low and middle income countries, so the green and red parts on this map. And one of the things that I really think is important, again, is the measuring not only impacts, as I said before, but also the metrics in all sorts of domains. When we talk of agriculture, the usual metric we are used to is kilograms per hectare. But this is far not enough. We need to go way beyond kilograms per hectare. We have to see what are the new metrics that take into account not only the resources used to produce, but also what happens with the product, what happens to the environment. And that's where we had these trade-offs between health, between environment, economics, and so on. So this shows that the system is becoming more and more complex, and it requires coherent solutions. So from there, we have then moved to different places. I will just illustrate. I will not repeat the names and the places, but we have been in the first session. We had this one in the second session, like Myanmar, India. And when I put small dots together, it means it was not located in a single place, but it was across the three continents. And then in the third session, we had Myanmar again, and then we had the SDC dialogue, and this was the climate perception. And then we had the posters. Maybe you have not all seen the posters, maybe you have seen them outside. There were the videos. If you want to watch the videos, they are online and they will be available. As well, of course, as the sessions. We maybe didn't say that, but for those who said, oh, but I missed that presentation, everything has been recorded and it can be viewed. So we had the poster sessions, 5 posters located in these places, also all over. So for us, this was, as a very short now summary overall, it was about food security and food safety. It was about healthy nutrition and access to food. It was about sustainable consumption. And then we had the second block where it was about sustainable production systems, ecosystem services, agroforestry, and organic agriculture. And then in the third block, we had about entrepreneurship and solution pathways, sustainable supply chains, and capacity building and education. So all these keywords, they were, if we put them together, there was generation of knowledge or co-creation of knowledge, as Johannes pointed it out. This co-creation is something very important. And then we have the transfer of knowledge. And from there, we go to the development of solutions and adaptation to the changing context. And this, of course, addressing the key issues. And what will all this be used for? It should be our contribution to the urgently needed global transformation. Everybody talks of transformation, and it's not just making business as usual a little bit different. It's a real change that is needed, and this is what we understand under this transformation. So this could not be done by Hafren. Hafren is just one very small player. And this is the list of all the stakeholders that were involved in today's work in a way or in another. And now for today, we put ourselves in the middle. It's just to show the network. We are just part of a big network, and without this network, we have no chance. And only the network will be able to address this transformation. So partnerships are key to effectively address the challenges ahead, in particular, research partnerships. When we talk of research partnerships, in particular, North-South, that is also mentioned here in the third position, North-South research partnerships, if you look at them, what are they really? The research is basically or mostly decided in the North, financed in the North, implemented from the North, and the south is more there as an alibi. So we have to think about this and how to make this north-south more equitable, and that's probably also part of the discussion that will need to be followed up. We have also public and private partnerships. We have partnerships between science and policy are very important. So, not repeat the fake news and things like that, but science has an important role to play. And of course, the development partnerships that are mentioned in second place, it's partnerships, not only researchers with researchers, but also researchers with development partners or stakeholders. Partnerships are not just nice to have, they are a condition to shape the future. And the issues at stake are also how to make inter and transdisciplinary approaches work better, how to implement participatory research and participatory approaches that are not just alibi participation, but are true participation, and then evidence-based, founded on solid scientific methods. Since early 2020, we have learned that partnerships and network do not necessarily require long-distance traveling. Online interaction works, but this way of interacting has also its limits. I tried to make a mood curve since the beginning of the pandemic, and the curve for me looks a bit like this. And looking at what does it mean from Huffle perspective now, from here, we had a real low at the beginning of the pandemic when our 2020 students in international agriculture could not leave for their field assignment. They had to stay in Switzerland, they had to change the topic, and that was really a low for us. And then, like, online teaching was discovered. So that was already improving the situation. We have discovered this, and we have even started doing international mandates online, doing interviews with stakeholders in Asia, in Africa, online. So that was also already better than doing nothing. And then the students, if we come here, they became tired of online teaching. So they were really happy students just having the right to come to school. Imagine, that was something unbelievable. And then 2021 students, they are now in their field assignment. We have students in Africa, we have students in Asia, and in Eastern Europe, and that is really great for us that even under special conditions, they are now again in the field. So hope is growing, but the limits of online collaboration, online cooperation are obvious. There are limits in collecting data, through partners. This is not so easy. And of course, also developing, testing, and refining solutions is also a challenge when you do it online. Now you see this MS Teams screen, so I would like just to thank the speakers today, starting with Lynette, and then Jacqueline, and Tanya, and Lucy, and Melanie, and Gurbir. You see the online and the presence are coming together. Hans, then Elisabeth and Johannes, Ueli and Felix, Christine and Deepak, and then we have Boke and Laura and Elisa and Samuel and Christina. These are all the presenters and authors of the posters. And then, of course, the moderators, Filippo, Jürgen, and the third moderator was already presented. And then we have, of course, the team of the Institute. Marina has done, she was always in the background, but she has done a tremendous job. And, oops, what happened? And the one that would have liked to be here, Bastian Mengel, he is in London. He was blocked by the British rules, not allowing him to come to Switzerland. So he was online the whole day today. He's still here. First, we wanted to have an interaction, but so we'll leave it like this, but many thanks to him as well. And then we had Ute, who, despite the fact that she had her second vaccine and was sick, she still did the opening. So the plus, of course, all those who did not have a space for the picture, I would especially point out Tabea, who has taken over the job of Jürgen, so in the last minute, but also the others that are on the board, plus all those who have contributed. So a big thank you to all these. Why do I present all the people? It's because the emergencies we face, not only climate and food, they are serious and they require our full attention. More than that, they require action now. Action now means joining our forces, our intelligence, our skills, our capacity to innovate, to exchange, to critically assess and to share. And this is required across generations, across genders, across cultures. From the pandemic, we have learned to conduct events online or in hybrid form, which allows participation from all over the world. Here you have a list of countries from where we had people registered for today's event. I will not go through the list, but I think it's nice to see that so many countries and places in the world were involved. So many thanks to the online participants and many thanks to those of you who could make it to Zollikofen. It was an honor and a great pleasure to have you on board today. Thank you very much.